Greetings and welcome to the Peace Operations Training Institute's webinar series. We are committed to bringing essential, practical knowledge to military personnel, police, and civilians working toward peace worldwide. To explore all the e-learning training programs offered by the Peace Operations Training Institute, you are invited to view our website at www.peaceopstraining.org. The Peace Operations Training Institute would like to thank the nations and the ministries of foreign affairs that provide the support so essential for the success of our webinars and all the programs we offer. These are Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. In this webinar, Dr. Harvey Langholtz, the Executive Director of the Peace Operations Training Institute, interviews General Robert Gordon, Army of the United Kingdom, retired, former force commander of the UN mission in Ethiopia and Eretria, and author of the course Principles and Guidelines for United Nations Peacekeeping Operations.
For POTI's first live webinar, we are proud to bring you General Robert Gordon, who co-drafted the UN's capstone doctrine, an important document that assesses the key principles and purposes of UN peacekeeping. Our course, Principles and Guidelines for UN Peacekeeping Operations, is essentially a pedagogical adaptation of the capstone doctrine, and General Gordon was very much involved in adapting it. The course was developed in consultation with the Peacekeeping Best Practices section of the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations Policy Evaluation Training Division and the Peace Operations Training Institute. With over 14,000 enrollments in its first year of release, it has quickly become our most popular course. Many of you have expressed your gratitude and satisfaction with this course, and we appreciate your submitting those comments. General Gordon served in the British Army from 1970 to 2005. During that span, he served with the United Nations in Cyprus, with UNPROFOR in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, and on the UN mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea, where he served as the force commander. He has remained active in the peacekeeping community since his retirement, serving as a consultant on peacekeeping operations for DPKO, the World Bank, and the British government. Today, General Gordon will say a few words about the Principles and Guidelines course, after which a question and answer session will immediately follow. We encourage viewers to participate by submitting questions via their Ustream accounts, through POTI's Facebook page or group page, through Twitter, or by sending an email to questions@peaceopstraining.org. So, without further ado, I am proud to present to you General Robert Gordon.
Harvey, thank you. And to all of you out there, hello. This is very much the first time I've ever participated in a webinar, and so I have no idea who is seeing this or whether you are interested in what I have to say. But as you hear, my name is Robert Gordon. I was very much part of delivering the POTI program, which many of you have now undertaken and which Harvey has introduced, on Principles and Guidelines for UN Peacekeeping. This course, again, as Harvey has identified, was very much based upon what we call the capstone doctrine, and I was privileged to be part of the team from DPKO that helped develop that capstone doctrine. The doctrine was published in 2008, and at the time it was very much designed as a guide for all UN personnel in the field, but also for people like yourselves out there who are new to peacekeeping and need a strategic introduction to the subject. Although it's designed to help plan and conduct peacekeeping operations, it doesn't give you a blueprint to every answer that you will be facing in the field. Peacekeeping, as many of you know, is a very complex and difficult process. You're working in a volatile, uncertain, and highly ambiguous environment. And often people search for answers in this process. Now, the doctrine will not give you answers, because quite often those answers will only come about by you studying and analysing the problems and then adapting principles to the answers that you need to deliver in the field. And so the doctrine is about principles and guidelines, and we like to call it a handrail. It provides a handrail to you in the field or you people in headquarters, be it nationally or internationally, who need some principles and guidelines in which to adapt your conduct. No blueprint, but principles and guidelines. And so if you approach the doctrine in that mindset of being a help and a guide to you, then I'm sure you'll get much from it. What it does not replace is study, effort, good analysis, and good leadership, and then adapting those characteristics to the situation that you face on the ground. So that's by way of introduction to the doctrine. I'm very happy, Harvey, thank you, to answer questions. I gather there are some questions coming in already from all corners of the world, and so we stand by to answer them.
Yes, we do have some questions, and I'm pleased to read them. The first one is from Chukwemeka in Nigeria, and the question is this. The deployment of a UN peacekeeping operation requires the approval of the Security Council with the 5 permanent members affirming such a decision. Sometimes the use of the veto power depends on economic and political reasons rather than actual conditions on the ground. With the emerging world situation, do you think the veto power is still necessary?
This is from Chukwemeka, yes, from Nigeria. It is easy for all of us to be frustrated at times with the structures that we have for international peace and security. The Security Council is a structure designed in 1945, but it's a structure that was very carefully designed, and the veto power that you talk about was given to the designers of the structure to ensure that there would be checks and balances in an uncertain world at that time. I think the best way of looking at this is that when member states in the Security Council choose not to pass a veto or choose to abstain from voting, then increasingly within the Security Council's deliberations, the veto becomes unnecessary. And more powerfully, when all the member states of the Security Council agree on a resolution, and let us be quite clear that when a resolution has been passed, it means that all members of the Security Council have either agreed it or some have abstained and chosen not to veto it or vote against it, then that becomes an extremely powerful demonstration of international will that something should be done. So, yes, we can say the Security Council could be better constructed, and I think the Security Council members are very aware of this, and work is going on to try and make sure that the Security Council meets the needs of the 21st century and the crises in the world that you so carefully identify. But I think these things take a little bit of time. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, yes. And our next question is from Matthew in Ghana, and Matthew asks, is it proper to allow countries which are currently involved in a conflict to participate in peacekeeping operations?
Matthew, I'm not sure quite what you have in mind. I think what we all need to be clear is that member states who participate in peacekeeping operations are volunteer member states who choose to send their sons and their daughters into conflict areas on behalf of states who are under stress. Now, clearly those states, those member states involved in conflict are there with the consent of the host nation and, of course, with the approval of the United Nations. There's clearly got to be an analysis of if a state is part of the conflict, then that probably would not have the consent of the United Nations or, in fact, the host nation. But the UN does rely on volunteer member states to come and do their bit for international peace and security. And it's important that we understand that voluntary nature. Member states have a variety of reasons for choosing to volunteer, but the UN does need those volunteers.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Antonio in Brazil. Can the General Assembly edit a resolution to establish a peacekeeping operation? Are the resolution and the mandate two different documents? If the answer is yes, can the General Assembly edit mandates for peacekeeping operations?
And that's from Antonio. Antonio, from your readings of the capstone doctrine, you will understand that the Security Council has primary responsibility for international peace and security. And it does that by, ultimately, by passing resolutions which have the status of international law. Member states of the United Nations, when they sign up to be a member state of the United Nations, accept these resolutions as international law and are bound by them. The General Assembly does pass resolutions, and those resolutions are profoundly influential in the international community, but they are not binding in international law. And so to answer very quickly your question, does the General Assembly then start changing UN or editing Security Council resolutions? No, it doesn't, and it doesn't have that power. But of course resolutions come from an exquisite process of diplomacy that leads to a resolution which has the support of the international community. As to your question of the difference in a mandate and a resolution, well, the resolution gives the mandate to the Secretariat, the UN Secretariat, then to take the appropriate action as directed or tasked within that resolution. So in the peacekeeping world, we tend to use resolution and mandate meaning the same thing. It is the international authority to allow the Secretariat to undertake action in support of peace and security.
Thank you. And this next question comes from Jabasco in Rwanda. If you were to deliver a 2-hour lesson to a pre-deployment peacekeeping class, A, what main points in the principles and guidelines would you stress? And B, please help to categorize these principles, the core ones, the behavioral ones, and the cultural ones.
Jabasco. A very good question. Clearly you've got to give a 2-hour lecture, which I will not write for you. But Jabasco, I think the point about principles and guidelines are those principles. And if we need to focus on anything, it's to ensure that the people you're lecturing have a really good and clear understanding of what those principles mean. What does consent actually mean? What does impartiality actually mean? How do we use force, and how do we limit the use of force, and when should we use force, and when should we not use force? What does legitimacy mean? What does credibility mean actually, and how do we ensure that we maintain credibility and legitimacy from our actions and our behavior? And finally, do understand that we're doing this on behalf of that host nation, that nation that is under stress, or is suffering from conflict, and people are dying or are in a bad state. And so it is their problem, and we're trying to help them overcome that problem. So that principle of national ownership or local ownership is paramount when it comes to understanding how and what we should do. So you could spend 2 hours quite happily focused on those principles and making sure that people really do understand those principles, which drive everything about UN peacekeeping. As to then your next part of the question, what is the core business? Well, again, if you go into the capstone doctrine, and I'm pretty sure it's in chapter 4, if you look in chapter 4, you'll see what the core business of UN peacekeeping is. That business of ensuring safety and security, of providing that political framework, and providing that coherent and coordinating structure for all in-country activity. So those are the things that you should need to focus on, I would suggest, if you've only got 2 hours to train a peacekeeper.
Good, thank you. And this next question comes to us from Zimbabwe. Why is security in the mission area the primary duty of the military observers, especially in the team site? And in United Nations operations, The military provides the forces and the observers. Is there a special reason why security is a civilian component while all civilians and equipment are protected by the military?
Well, the first part of the question, I think that was from Dora, the first part in Nigeria, about why are the military observers providing security. Well, and again, the question to Stephen in Zimbabwe about who provides security. The first point you both need to understand is security is the responsibility of the host nation. So wherever the peacekeeping mission is deployed, that host nation is responsible under international law for the safety and security of the international peacekeepers deployed to their country. Now, certain countries who are in a state of stress can't necessarily provide that security, so mechanisms within the UN have to be put in place to ensure the safety and security of the peacekeepers. Peacekeepers come in various forms. Military peacekeepers can look after themselves. They're trained to use force, they're armed, they're protected, they understand how to look after themselves in dangerous environments. And the same goes for armed police forces in our formed police units. But the peacekeepers who make the real peacebuilding and humanitarian and political and elections and human rights and rule of law differences are unarmed peacekeepers who need protection. So the UN needs to have a policy and a management structure that looks after its unarmed peacekeepers in a hostile environment, which is why we have the UN Security Management System, the responsibility of the Department of Safety and Security, and why you have security advisors in the field who are civilian, who are there to ensure that the safety and security of those peacekeepers is undertaken. Now, the military and the police have a role in this safety and security as well. And so it's all undertaken by the security management team, of which you'll have read about in the capstone doctrine.
Thank you. And there's a follow-on question here from Stephen in Zimbabwe. And he asks, in a security survey, what are the main issues to consider before, during, and after the survey? Is an estimate necessary? In military operations, a plan is the result of an estimate or an appreciation. In the UN, do civilians do an estimate? If not, how do they come up with a plan?
Well, let's start at the end. The UN makes plans, clearly, and those plans are from a sophisticated integrated process of planning. The military are experienced in planning, and military spend a lot of their time planning, and so the military have structures and procedures which help them plan. But the UN also does this. Quite a lot of UN planning is based on military principles. And so the product of this integrated planning by civilians, military, police, diplomats, humanitarians, developmental actors, all working together, is a mission plan, an integrated mission plan. Does that come from what you call an estimate? Yes, it does. It comes from a rigorous conflict analysis and technical assessment of the situation, the conflict, the causes of the conflict, and how we as the international community can deal with that conflict. Now, you talk about a security survey. What is a security survey? Well, if we're talking about a conflict analysis, it's what is the problem, why is that conflict there, and what are its causes? Or you could be talking at a lower level, which is a threat assessment, again, undertaken by the safety and security staff, who will look at the risks involved in the programmatic activity of the peacekeepers. Be assured that we have, in the UN peacekeeping world, there are highly professional people who understand the need to plan, the need to make estimates, and the need to make threat assessments to ensure that we can operate in an insecure environment.
Okay, thank you. And this next question from Sunny in Nigeria. And Sunny asks, the impact of paramilitary forces on peacekeeping missions is not addressed in the text. Why?
And Sunny, I'm not sure what you mean by paramilitary forces. If you mean spoilers or militias or armed organizations who are working against the peace process, then that is addressed in very much addressed in the doctrine. If by paramilitary forces you mean, in a sense you might mean, it means you mean private military organizations, and I'm not sure whether you do mean that. That is not addressed in the capstone doctrine, and it's something I think that we will need to do in the future, is look at the role of private security organizations in support of peacekeeping. But that is work that we need to undertake.
Thank you. And this next question comes from Athian in South Sudan. And there are two questions here. In peacekeeping operations, I learned there are three categories of peacekeepers: military, police, and civilian peacekeepers. Can you please explain the different roles played by these forces? And the second question...
Well, can we stop there? Yeah, okay, we'll come back to the second one, otherwise I'll forget. And the categories, civilian peacekeepers, police, and military. Well, I imagine you're quite clear what the military do. The military, they're disciplined bunches of people able to use force, but able to bring their capabilities, be they engineering, be they patrolling, be they observing, be they protecting civilians, to bring that armed, disciplined activity in support of a peace process. The police are there very much to support both the rule of law and to provide security. And in many ways the police have a much tougher task, because they have to span the spectrum of activity from community policing through to providing a secure response to civil disorder, for instance, in towns and cities. Now, the civilian component, and we talk about a civilian component, but of course the civilian component is hugely broad and complex. And it covers everything from the head of mission, her or himself, who is a civilian clearly, through to the political affairs office, to the civil affairs office, to the human rights office, to the elections office, to the legal office, to all the administrators who work hard. All of these people, we call it a civilian component, and it's not a very good way of describing the many, many peacekeepers who are not in uniform, who are working hard in a dangerous environment in support of peace and security.
Thank you. And then the second question from Athian in South Sudan. Secondly, can anyone serve in UN peacekeeping operations without a military background or without military training?
Absolutely. Yes, and I think we need... So who's this from? Athian, yes. Athian, we need to understand that peacekeeping is a multicultural, multidimensional process. The military component of peacekeeping is there essentially to stabilize the situation, to hold the ring, to stop the violence, to stop the killing. But actually they don't make the difference. To get at those root causes of that conflict, you need those experts, be they election experts, be they civil society experts, be they legal experts, human rights experts, who are civilian people who are experts in their field. They can operate in an environment which is secured by the military peacekeepers. So can you get involved in peacekeeping if you're not in the military? Absolutely yes, but you have to bring an expertise which is relevant and appropriate to the area of deployment where there is peace and insecurity and a peacekeeping mission.
Thank you. And this next question comes from Piro in Chad. Can a peacekeeping operation turn into a peace enforcement operation? If so, what would the procedure be?
Very interesting question from Pierrot. The UN does peacekeeping. Peacekeeping operations are authorized through the Security Council, but increasingly the Security Council calls upon Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and again you'll have read about that hopefully in your course, which Chapter 7 is the chapter that authorizes the use of sanctions and then ultimately the use of force in support of a peace process. But peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, is still driven by consent. And so when we use Chapter 7, for instance, to protect civilians who are covered by the mandate, we under international law can use force, but it's still very much a peacekeeping mission. Now, peace enforcement is a very different concept, and sometimes we get confused because while keeping the peace, at times we have to enforce that peace, especially enforce it against those who are working against that peace process. That is still peacekeeping. Peace enforcement, though, is when internationally we intervene without the consent of the member state. So your question, when can we change from peacekeeping to peace enforcement? I would answer that while we're keeping the peace under a Security Council resolution, we often, under Chapter 7, have to use force and enforce that peace process. That is not peace enforcement. If we want to change to peace enforcement, then you would need a completely different Security Council resolution, and it would not be a UN peacekeeping mission.
Thank you. And the next question a student submits is this: what are the boundaries of the use of force on UN peacekeepers?
I'm not sure which student sent this one in. The boundaries of the use of force are called the rules of engagement. But of course those rules of engagement are also constrained by principles, and if you look at Chapter 3 of your doctrine and the lesson, you will see that we discuss in some detail the principles about the use of force or the non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate within UN peacekeeping. But under Chapter 7 we are often authorized to use force to protect civilians. And so when we are authorized to do it, when we use force, we use it with the principles of the minimum use of force. We use it in a calibrated way. We use it in a way to influence behavior. We're not neutralizing an enemy. We're not destroying an enemy. We don't have an enemy. We just have a political process. And so the boundaries of the use of force are constrained by principles, they're constrained by international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict, and ultimately they're constrained by the rules of engagement of the peacekeepers, rules of engagement which they each, every one of them, need to intimately understand and be practiced on their implementation.
Thank you. And the next question from a student: would you please explain the difference between neutrality and impartiality within UN peacekeeping?
That's an old chestnut. And I hope, again, in Chapter 3, we do discuss those differences. Neutrality was one of the original Dag Hammarskjöld, Ralph Bunche principles of peacekeeping, of consent, neutrality, and non-use of force. Very much as we discuss in the capstone doctrine, those principles in the complex world of multidimensional peacekeeping have been adapted to an extent. And so we tend not to talk about neutrality, we talk about impartiality. Because we're making the point that we are impartial to the mandate. And it's the mandate we're there to serve, to look after, to implement, and those people protected by that mandate. Neutrality implies this is not our problem, we are not going to do things. If there is a problem between parties, well, we're neutral to this, so we will not take action. And so we need to be very clear that impartiality means something different to neutrality. It's complicated because actually UN humanitarians and humanitarian community generally also have these principles of impartiality and neutrality, but their meaning of those principles is very different to our meaning as peacekeepers. When they talk about impartiality as a humanitarian, what they're saying is that we will deliver need wherever that need is, irrespective of religion, politics, culture, creed, or whatever. Peacekeepers don't say that. Their impartiality is to the mandate. And if people are breaking the mandate or the peace process, then under that mandate, the UN may well take impartial action to proscribe that sort of activity. So we need to be very clear what we mean by impartiality and neutrality, and peacekeepers need to be ensured that they are clear that neutrality is different from impartiality. We are impartial. We don't tend to be neutral because quite often we have to take action.
Thank you. And the next question from a student is this. I thought UN peacekeeping was about peacekeeping, and yet much of the doctrine talks about peace building. Why is a peacekeeping organization talking about peace building?
Yes, I think that this is very much a developing theme, and we talk about the nexus, which is the interface between peacekeeping and peace building. And we have discovered through 60 years of UN peacekeeping and the best practice that has driven that unless you tackle the root causes of a conflict, that conflict will re-emerge. And so in the past we would send peacekeepers to stop the conflict. Conflict would be stopped, peacekeepers would leave, conflict restarts. Peace building is an attempt to get at those root causes. What makes society, people be in conflict with each other? And you don't do that by just sending armed military peacekeepers. You can only do that by putting in place developmental, social, environmental, humanitarian structures which get at those causes of peace. Now, if we call that peace building, that's what we mean by peace building in peacekeeping. And what we're saying is that if we really want to make a difference, if we want to make sure a country goes from conflict to a sustainable peace, we better make sure that we start building the foundations of peace building right at the start during the peacekeeping phase. That's why we spend quite a lot of time in UN peacekeeping talking about issues which might look like peace building but actually are designed to get at the root causes of conflict.
Thank you. And Emmanuel in Rwanda asks this. How can I become involved in peacekeeping operations?
Emmanuel, I'm pleased that you're keen to be involved, and well done, because we need volunteers for peacekeeping. I don't know whether you're a soldier, a police officer, a humanitarian, so it really depends on what particular characteristic and expertise you bring to peacekeeping. If you're in the military, it's quite simple. You just make sure to your government and to your Ministry of Defence that you're keen and interested in UN peacekeeping, and leave it to the processes within the military or the police, it equally applies, to dispatch you on a UN peacekeeping mission. If you're a civilian, then you have to have certain qualifications which the UN needs. And so depending upon what your qualifications are, depends on how you can become involved with peacekeeping. But the first part is to want to do something for peacekeeping, and you clearly have passed that particular test. Harvey, can you help this correspondent on this issue?
Yes, I can. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm pleased to point out that on our website we have a special career resources section. And if you go to that career resources section, you will see a list of websites, links, opportunities for making applications. Now let me be quick to point out we do not receive applications here. We do not process applications. We do not provide employment. We provide training. And as part of that, we like to keep our students informed on where they can make further applications. So go to the career resources section on the website, and I hope it will be helpful to you. The next question.
Good. It's good that he's keen, though.
Yes, it is. We're glad to see that interest. Absolutely. Excellent. We support it, encourage it. The next question comes from Zimbabwe. In other countries, the legal age of majority is far below that which is considered in the UN. How is underage determined?
Yes, I think this is an interesting question. And I think the issue here is that when you become a UN peacekeeper, be you soldier, police or civilian, you don the mantle of the United Nations. You accept the principles, the conduct of the United Nations. And that bar is set quite high. You leave behind all your national freedoms and your national rights, and you accept that you are a UN peacekeeper, and you abide by the standards of the United Nations. And the United Nations has set the age of minority as 18, albeit that in many, many states women can have men and women can have relationships with women who are under 18 or men who are under 18, not in the United Nations. We've set those UN standards, and those are standards which are global standards. And those are the standards, if you're involved in UN peacekeeping, that the UN expects its peacekeepers to follow. And it's exactly the same as standards involved in behavior within the environment. We have to understand that we as peacekeepers are operating in a very distressed environment where people are vulnerable. And unless we have the highest standards when operating in those societies which are distressed, are extremely vulnerable, we become part of the problem and not part of the solution. And that's why the UN has these very, very high standards and expects its peacekeepers to follow those standards.
That's all true. And the next question from a student. How has peacekeeping evolved since the release of the capstone doctrine?
Yes, the capstone doctrine, as you know, came out in 2008 and has cascaded through peacekeeping missions and peacekeeping nations and troop contributing countries since then. It is almost a timeless doctrine in the sense that it is about espousing the principles and guidelines, as I said very much in my introduction. But peacekeeping is moving on. I would say the areas where it's moving on is increasingly we are focusing on quality and not quantity, which means that we need better trained, better equipped, better resourced peacekeepers. We also need to improve the peacekeepers' understanding of what actually they are doing. And this means we've got a much improved dialogue now between the Secretariat, the Security Council, and the troop and police contributing countries, who themselves are very much part now of this resolution and decision-making process. So that three-legged stool, the Secretariat, the Security Council, and the member states who are engaged and interested in peacekeeping, is improving. And I think that is a development that has taken place very much since 2008. The other area, I think, of development since we wrote the Capstone Doctrine is this whole business of partnership. The UN is not the sole instrument of international peace and security. And so partnerships with organizations, particularly in Africa, say, the African Union and its regional or sub-regional mechanisms, is something that is happening increasingly in support of peace and security. And we only have to look at what the UN are doing in support of AMIS in Somalia, at the hybrid mission in Darfur, and in issues around the creation of the new state of South Sudan to understand the direction that UN peacekeeping is now moving.
And this question from a student, do you see the Chapter 6.5 approach as still valid, or has UN peacekeeping evolved since then?
Well, let me declare my hand on this. I don't like the expression Chapter 6.5. And I think it has led to a lot of muddle thinking and muddle reactions in the field, with people not quite sure what they should be doing. In my view, and this is very much a personal view, a member state wanting to be involved in peacekeeping needs to look at the mandate. Look very clearly at what the Security Council are asking the troop contributing countries through the mission to undertake. In that mandate, which is a peacekeeping mandate, it may well be that the Security Council have called upon Chapter 7 under international law to authorize the use of force to protect people who are vulnerable to conflict, protect the civilians. Now, is that Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 mission? Well, or is it horrifically a Chapter 6.5 mission? It is a mission. It is a UN peacekeeping mission which calls the peacekeepers to do a whole variety of things, but under Chapter 7 it also calls them to use force to protect vulnerable people and civilians who are suffering from that conflict. And I think that's what we need to focus on, and that's what we need to be quite clear about when we train our peacekeepers for peacekeeping missions. Look at the mandate, look at what is required of us as peacekeepers, understand the rules of engagement, and then train our people to act accordingly.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're almost out of time.
We had questions. They keep flowing in. I'm impressed.
Well, we're happy to receive these questions. I think we've addressed them, and I appreciate your responding. So this concludes our webinar. We thank General Gordon for his time, his expertise, and for his ongoing efforts for peace. So thank you very much, sir. This session will be archived on our website and available to students for future viewing. Be sure to check our website regularly for upcoming webinars with other course authors and peace operations experts. I'm Harvey Langholtz, the Executive Director of the Peace Operations Training Institute. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you for viewing this webinar. We are pleased to bring this webinar to you, and we invite you to view our website to see all the programs and courses we offer. If you would like to view the archived version of this webinar or any of our previous webinars, please visit www.peaceopstraining.org/webinars. They are also available on our YouTube channel. We thank our students worldwide serving on peacekeeping missions. The Peace Operations Training Institute is dedicated to serving you.